Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes. We probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings series. And today I'll be talking about a battle in the Third Age of Middle-earth that falls a bit under the radar, but I'd argue is one of the most important military victories of the Third Age, prior to the War of the Ring. Its effect on the cultural and political landscape of Middle-earth for the 1,000 years leading up to the War of the Ring is impressive, in both positive and negative ways. You've probably guessed from the title of this video, but that battle is the Battle of the Camp. Admittedly, not as sexy a title as the Battle of Sudden Flame, or the unmatched Battle of Unnumbered Tears. But don't let the uninspiring name fool you. The Battle of the Camp is quite high in the pantheon of notable military campaigns. In some ways, it's as notable for what came after as for the battle itself. The Battle of the Camp begins in the year 1944 of the Third Age. Remember, the War of the Ring begins in the year 3018. But I'm going to start the story back in the year 1851. That's the year that the appendices tell us the Wainriders began attacking Gondor. Here's a quote from the appendices describing a series of evils that befell Gondor. You probably know this already, but a wain is a wagon or cart, hence Wainriders. The third evil was the invasion of the Wainriders, which sapped the waning strength of Gondor in wars that lasted for almost 100 years. The Wainriders were a people, or a confederacy of many peoples, that came from the east, but they were stronger and better armed than any that had appeared before. They journeyed in great wains, and their chieftains fought in chariots. Stirred up, as was afterwards seen by the emissaries of Sauron, they made a sudden assault upon Gondor, and King Narmacil II was slain in battle with them beyond Anduin in 1856. The people of eastern and southern Rhovanion were enslaved, and the frontiers of Gondor were for that time withdrawn to the Anduin and the Emyn. At this time it is thought that the Ringwraiths re-entered Mordor. Kalimitar, son of Narmacil II, helped by a revolt in Rhovanion, avenged his father with a great victory over the Easterlings upon Dagorlad in 1899, and for a while the peril was averted. It was in the reign of Arafant in the north, and of Andahur, son of Kalimitar in the south, that the two kingdoms again took counsel together after long silence and estrangement. For at last they perceived that some single power and will was directing the assault from many quarters upon the survivors of Numenor. So I threw out a lot of names and dates there. I think the most important takeaway from that passage is that Sauron is behind these incursions. He sent the Witch King to attack Arnor in the north, and the Wainriders to attack Gondor in the south. And it's not until around 1900 that the kings of Arnor and Gondor, Arafant and Andahur, collectively realize that the assaults on their kingdoms are not random. A single power is directing these attacks. Note the enslavement and subsequent revolt of the people of Rhovanion. Those people include the Eotheod, who will later become the Rohirrim after they save Gondor's bacon in a future battle at the Field of Celebrant in 2510. But for now, they are Northmen living in Rhovanion, trying to survive against the Wainriders. There's good reason to believe that when it came to the culture of the Wainriders, Tolkien was inspired by the Huns, who rode horses and wagons and chariots, became a confederacy of many peoples, and attacked the Goths from the east. I just mentioned how the Wainriders attacked and enslaved the Northmen in Rhovanion. Rhovanion includes Mirkwood. As it happens, Mirkwood was the historical name for the forest boundary between the Huns and the Goths. And when I was researching this, I saw that Christopher Tolkien translated an Old Norse heroic poem, The Battle of the Goths and Huns, which includes the line, "The renowned forest that is named Mirkwood." So, back to our Huns/Wainriders. In 1899, they are soundly defeated by Gondor and a simultaneous revolt by the enslaved Northmen in Rhovanion. So, the Wainriders are down, but they're not out. We get this quote from the Unfinished Tales. In the meanwhile, the Wainriders licked their wounds and plotted their revenge. Beyond the reach of the arms of Gondor, in lands east of the Sea of Rhûn, from which no tidings came to its kings, their kinsfolk spread and multiplied, and they were eager for conquests and filled with hatred of Gondor, which stood in their way. It was long, however, before they moved. On the one hand, they feared the might of Gondor, and knowing nothing of what passed west of Anduin, they believed that its realm was larger and more populous than it was in truth at that time. On the other hand, the eastern Wainriders had been spreading southward beyond Mordor, and were in conflict with the peoples of Khand and their neighbors further south. Eventually, a peace and alliance was agreed between these enemies of Gondor, and an attack was prepared that should be made at the same time from north and south. Little or nothing, of course, was known of these designs and movements in Gondor. What is here said was deduced from the events long afterwards by historians, to whom it was also clear that the hatred of Gondor and the alliance of its enemies in concerted action, for which they themselves had neither the will nor the wisdom, was due to the machinations of Sauron. Forthwini, lord of the Eotheod, indeed warned King Andahur that the Wainriders of Rhovanion were recovering from their weakness and fear, and he suspected that they were receiving new strength from the east, for he was much troubled by raids into the south of his land that came both up the river and through the narrows of the forest. But Gondor could do no more at that time than gather and train as great an army as it could find or afford. Thus, when the assault came at last, it did not find Gondor unprepared, though its strength was less than it needed. So we get another confirmation of the machinations of Sauron, the puppet master pulling the strings. The Wainriders have made a pact with their former enemies, the Khand, and together they're making raids on Rhovanion and preparing for a major assault on Gondor. King Andahur relishes the idea of leading his army into battle, but he isn't foolishly headstrong. He makes some tactical decisions. Andahur was aware that his southern enemies were preparing for war, and he had the wisdom to divide his forces into a northern army and a southern. The latter was the smaller, for the danger from that quarter was held to be less. It was under the command of Eärnil, a member of the royal house, being a descendant of King Tulumatar, father of Narmacil II. His base was at Pelargir. The northern army was commanded by King Andahur himself. This had always been the custom of Gondor, that the king, if he willed, should command his army in a major battle, provided that an heir with undisputed claim to the throne was left behind. Andahur came of a warlike line, and was loved and esteemed by his army. And he had 2 sons, both of age to bear arms, Artamir the elder, and Faramir, some 3 years younger. Eärnil, a royal cousin, is leading a portion of Gondor's army from his base at Pelargir in the south. Andahur is leading the larger army himself, but ensuring that at least one of his heirs stays behind. That's going to be Faramir, similar to the more famous Faramir generations later, in that they're both second sons, the heir and the spare. All is in readiness. The armies are on alert. They know the enemy's coming, they're just not sure where the enemy is. From the Unfinished Tales. News of the oncoming of the enemy reached Pelargir on the 9th day of Curmier, July, in the year 1944. Eärnil had already made his dispositions. He had crossed the Anduin with half his force, and leaving by design the fords of the Poros undefended, had encamped some 40 miles north in South Ithilien. King Andahur had purposed to lead his army north through Ithilien and deploy it on the Dagorlad, a field of ill omen for the enemies of Gondor. At that time, the forts upon the line of the Anduin north of Sarn-Gabir were still in repair and manned by sufficient soldiers to prevent any attempt of an enemy to cross the river at the Undeeps. But the news of the northern assault did not reach Andahur until the morning of the 12th day of Cormier, by which time the enemy was already drawing near, whereas the army of Gondor had been moving more slowly than it would if Andahur had received earlier warning, and its vanguard had not yet reached the gates of Mordor. The main force was leading with the king and his guards, followed by the soldiers of the right wing and the left wing, which would take up their places when they passed out of Ithilien and approached the Dagorlad. There, they expected the assault to come from the north or northeast, as it had before in the Battle of the Plains and in the victory of Kalimatar on the Dagorlad. But it was not so. The Wainriders had mustered a great host by the southern shores of the inland sea of Rhûn, strengthened by men of their kinsfolk in Rhovanion and from their new allies in Khand. When all was ready, they set out for Gondor from the east, moving with all the speed they could along the line of the arid Lithui, where their approach was not observed until too late. So it came to pass that the head of the army of Gondor had only drawn level with the gates of Mordor, the Morannon, when a great dust, borne on a wind from the east, announced the oncoming of the enemy vanguard. Okay, the two armies of Gondor are now being positioned in the north and south of Ithilien. Eärnil's army is laying a trap in the south at the fords of the Poros, camping 40 miles to the north with an eye towards drawing the enemy into that choke point. Andahur's army intends to replay the battle from 1899 in which Gondor defeated the Wainriders on the plains of Dagorlad. They're marching north to those plains, expecting the Wainriders to come at them from the north-northeast. Part of this reasoning is that the Anduin is very well guarded north of the region. So, if the Wainriders want to cross the Anduin into Gondor, they're going to have to come south. So, as Andahur's army marches north, they're flanked on the east by a wall of mountains, the Mountains of Shadow. Little does Andahur know that the Wainriders are not coming from the north. They're heading directly west, flanked by the arid Lithui, the Ash Mountains to the south. Whether by design or not, the timing is perfect for the Wainriders. Just as the northern edge of Andahur's fairly stretched out army turns and heads east past the Black Gate, they're hit with a massive cavalry charge. It's going to be a long day for Andahur's army. The enemy vanguard was composed not only of the war chariots of the Wainriders, but also of a force of cavalry far greater than any that had been expected. Andahur had only time to turn and face the assault with his right flank close to the Morannon, and to send word to Minotaur, captain of the right wing behind, to cover his flank as swiftly as he could, when the chariots and horsemen crashed into his disordered line. Of the confusion of the disaster that followed, few clear reports were ever brought to Gondor. Andahur was utterly unprepared to meet a charge of horsemen and chariots in great weight. With his guard and his banner, he had hastily taken up a position on a low knoll, but this was of no avail. The main charge was hurled against his banner, and it was captured. His guard was almost annihilated, and he himself was slain, and his son Artemer at his side. Their bodies were never recovered. The assault of the enemy passed over them, and about both sides of the knoll, driving deep into the disordered ranks of Gondor, hurling them back in confusion upon those behind, and scattering and pursuing many others westward into the dead marshes. Minotaur took command. He was a man both valiant and war-wise. The first fury of the onslaught was spent, with far less loss and greater success than the enemy had looked for. The cavalry and chariots now withdrew, for the main host of the Wainriders was approaching. In such time as he had, Minotaur raised his own banner, rallied the remaining men of the center and those of his own command that were at hand. He at once sent messengers to Adrahil of Dol Amroth, the captain of the left wing, commanding him to withdraw with all speed he could both his own command and those at the rear of the right wing who had not yet been engaged. With these forces, he was to take up a defensive position between Caer Andros, which was manned, and the mountains of Ephel-Duath, where owing to the great eastward loop of the Anduin, the land was at its narrowest, to cover as long as he could the approaches to Minas Tirith. Minotaur himself, to allow time for this retreat, would form a rear guard and attempt to stem the advance of the main host of the Wainriders. Adrihil should at once send messengers to find Eärnil, if they could, and inform him of the disaster of the Morannon and of the position of the retreating northern army. So the king has died in battle, along with his eldest son. Minotaur and Adrihil are commanding 2 of the 3 battalions, the 3rd battalion now leaderless. Minotaur rallies the remnants of Andahr's battalion to his own. He intends to stall for time, giving Adrihil a chance to set up a defensive line at the narrow gap between Caer Andros and the Mountains of Shadow, Thermopylae style. He also says to send messengers to Eärnil. This next section is interesting because the text trails off. Christopher Tolkien jumps in to interpret the remainder of his father's notes. It's a longer passage, but worth it. From the Unfinished Tales. When the main host of the Wainriders advanced to the attack, it was then 2 hours after noon, and Minotaur had withdrawn his line to the head of the great northern road of Ithilien, half a mile beyond the point where it turned east to the watchtowers of the Morannon. The first triumph of the Wainriders was now the beginning of their undoing. Ignorant of the numbers and ordering of the defending army, they had launched their first onslaught too soon, before the greater part of that army had come out of the narrow land of Ithilien. And the charge of their chariots and cavalry had met with a success far swifter and more overwhelming than they had expected. It may well be supposed that, elated by the fall of the king and the rout of a large part of the opposing center, they believed that they had already overthrown the defending army, and that their own main army had little more to do than advance to the invasion and occupation of Gondor. If that were so, they were deceived. The Wainriders came on in little order, still exultant and singing songs of victory, seeing as yet no signs of any defenders to oppose them, until they found that the road into Gondor turned south into a narrow land of trees under the shadow of the dark Ephel-Duath, where an army could march, or ride, in good order only down a great highway. Before them, it ran on through a deep cutting. Here the text abruptly breaks off, and the notes and jottings for its continuation are for the most part illegible. It is possible to make out, however, that the men of the Eotheod fought with Andahr, and also that Andahr's second son, Faramir, was ordered to remain in Minas Tirith as regent, for it was not permitted by the law that both his sons should go into battle at the same time. But Faramir did not do so. He went to the war in disguise and was slain. The writing here is almost impossible to decipher, but it seems that Faramir joined the Eotheod and was caught with a party of them as they retreated towards the Dead Marshes. The leader of the Eotheod came to their rescue, but Faramir died in his arms, and it was only when he searched his body that he found tokens that showed he was the prince. The leader of the Eotheod then went to join Minotaur at the head of the North Road in Ithilien, who at that very moment was giving an order for a message to be taken to the prince in Minas Tirith, who was now the king. It was then that the leader of the Eotheod gave him the news that the prince had gone disguised into battle and had been slain. The presence of the Eotheod and the part played by their leader may explain the inclusion in this narrative, ostensibly to be an account of the beginnings of the friendship of Gondor and the Rohirrim. The concluding passage of the fully written text gives the impression that the host of the Wainriders were about to receive a check to their exultation and elation as they came down the highway into the deep cutting. But the notes at the end show that they were not long held up by the rearguard defense of Minotaur. The Wainriders poured relentlessly into Ithilien, and late on the 13th day of Curmier, they overwhelmed Minotaur, who was slain by an arrow. He is here said to have been King Andahr's sister son. His men carried him out of the fray, and all that remained of the rearguard fled southwards to find Adrihil. The chief commander of the Wainriders then called a halt to the advance and held a feast. Nothing more can be made out. So we have a gripping plot twist in which Minotaur, in the process of sending a warning to the new king in Minas Tirith, Andaher's second son Faramir, learns in real time that Faramir ignored his father's orders, came to the battle in disguise, and is now dead. Meaning there are no more male heirs, only Andaher's daughter, Firiel. Minotaur himself dies soon thereafter. It's grim stuff. Christopher Tolkien points out that the inclusion of the Eotheod in the battle, and Faramir dying in the Eotheod Lord's arms, shows the early days of the alliance between Gondor and what will become the Rohirrim. Minotaur's holding action succeeds? Question mark? He's killed, and the shattered remnants of his battalion are forced to retreat. But the Wainrider commander calls a halt to their advance, and the Wainriders have a victory feast, thus buying time for Gondor's army to regroup. This next quote is from Appendix A. It's a quick summary of the entire battle, but it gives us some of the only text describing how Eärnil's army won a devastating victory at the fords of the Poros in the south, then hurried up to the northern battle lines and crushed the Wainriders during their premature celebration. Technically, I think this hastily explained paragraph is the Battle of the Camp. But I think seeing it in the context of the death of the king and his sons, and the very real danger posed to Minas Tirith and Gondor, makes the prelude to this battle worthy of inclusion. Still from the Unfinished Tales. In 1944, King Andaher and both his sons, Artamir and Faramir, fell in battle north of the Morannon, and the enemy poured into Ithilien. But Eärnil, captain of the southern army, won a great victory in South Ithilien, and destroyed the army of Harad that had crossed the river Poros. Hastening north, he gathered to him all that he could of the retreating northern army, and came up against the main camp of the Wainriders while they were feasting and reveling, believing that Gondor was overthrown, and that nothing remained but to take the spoil. Eärnil stormed the camp and set fire to the wains, and drove the enemy in a great rout out of Ithilien. A great part of those who fled before him perished in the dead marshes. In the tale of years, the victory of Eärnil is called the Battle of the Camp. So first off, we see that Eärnil's plan to lure the Haradrim into the fords of the Poros and ambush them during the crossing worked flawlessly. He then essentially ambushes the Wainriders, attacking while they're feasting, and driving the survivors north to die in the dead marshes. His tactics win the day, and the Wainriders are never again considered a serious threat to Gondor. They have been beaten. And now we come to the moment that I think elevates this battle in importance. It's a noteworthy victory on its face, no doubt. But after this battle, a chance for unity arises that will not come again for another 1,000 years. And it's Eärnil's recent display of military prowess that ultimately tilts the scales against unity. Okay, the threats from the east and south have been dealt with, but Andaher and the two princes are dead. Pelendur, King Andaher's steward, is temporarily in charge of Gondor. But remember, I mentioned Andaher had a daughter, Firiel. Turns out, she married the king of Arthedain, Arvedui, an ancestor of Aragorn, who would be the rightful king of Arnor had it not descended into a civil war years earlier. When Arvedui was born, his father's seer, Malbeth, who I've done a video on if you're interested, gave a prophecy. The name Arvedui means last king. Arvedui you shall call him, for he will be the last in Arthedain. Though a choice will come to the Dunedain, and if they take the one that seems less hopeful, then your son will change his name and become king of a great realm. If not, then much sorrow and many lives of men shall pass, until the Dunedain arise and are united again. Malbeth has a talent for prophecies, and is also responsible for the "From the north shall he come, need shall drive him, he shall pass the door to the paths of the dead" Aragorn prophecy. But what I find interesting about the Arvedui prophecy is he leaves it up to a choice, as though fate has not been set in stone. A choice will come to the Dunedain, and if they take the one that seems less hopeful, as though there's an alternate timeline in which the correct choice was made. And that choice is being made by Pelennor and the Council of Gondor. So Arvedui and Firiel step up to claim the vacant throne of Gondor. On the death of Andahur and his sons, Arvedui of the North Kingdom claimed the crown of Gondor as the direct descendant of Isildur and as the husband of Firiel, only surviving child of Andahur. The claim was rejected. In this, Pelennor, the steward of King Gondor, played the chief part. The Council of Gondor answered, "The crown and royalty of Gondor belong solely to the heirs of Meneldil, son of Anarion, to whom Isildur relinquished this realm. In Gondor, this heritage is reckoned through the sons only. We have not heard that the law is otherwise in Arnor." To this Arvedui replied, "Elendil had 2 sons, of whom Isildur was the elder and the heir of his father. We have heard that the name of Elendil stands to this day at the head of the line of the kings of Gondor, since he was accounted the high king of all lands of the Dunedain. While Elendil still lived, rule in the south was committed to his sons. But when Elendil fell, Isildur departed to take up the high kingship of his father, and committed the rule in the south in like manner to the son of his brother. He did not relinquish his royalty in Gondor, nor intend that the realm of Elendil should be divided forever. Moreover, in Numenor of old, the scepter descended to the eldest child of the king, whether man or woman. It is true that the law has not been observed in the lands of exile ever troubled by war, but such was the law of our people, to which we now refer, seeing that the sons of Andahur died childless." To this Gondor made no answer. The crown was claimed by Eärnil, the victorious captain, and it was granted to him with the approval of all the Dunedain in Gondor, since he was of the royal house. He was, this is a mouthful, the son of Siriandil, son of Kalimasil, son of Arsirius, brother of Narmasil II. Arvedui did not press his claim, for he had neither the power nor the will to oppose the choice of the Dunedain of Gondor. Yet his claim was never forgotten by his descendants, even when their kingship had passed away. For the time was now drawing near when the North Kingdom would come to an end. In Gondor also, one king only followed Eärnil. That would be Eärnor, his son, who rode off to a duel with the Witch King and never came back. It may be that if the crown and the scepter had been united, then the kingship would have been maintained and much evil averted. But Eärnil was a wise man and not arrogant, even if, as to most men in Gondor, the realm in Arthedain seemed a small thing, for all the lineage of its lords. Really interesting. A married couple, the heir of Arnor and arguably the heir of Gondor, make a claim for the throne. Their claim is rejected because Firiel is a woman, and the crown of Gondor only passes down to sons. Their counter-argument is an excellent one. This royal line extends back to Numenor, and Numenor had no such rule. Men and women were eligible to inherit the throne. Tolkien writes, "To this, Gondor made no answer." Why? Because their sons-only argument was a pretext. They wanted a strong, victorious military leader to rule, not this king from the divided north. The last line of that quote is very telling. To most men in Gondor, the realm in Arthedain seemed a small thing, for all the lineage of its lords. And so Eärnil, with his son of the guy who's the friend of the roommate's lineage, claims the crown. To his credit, he rules well, though he sends troops to Arthedain too late to save them, and the north crumbles. And once his son, Eärnur, disappears after being lured out by the Witch King, the south is ruled by the stewards. I should note that Eärnil ruled as Eärnil II. Eärnil I ruled Gondor about 1,000 years earlier. In an interesting parallel, He came to power after his uncle, King Taranon, died childless. And he died in a shipwreck, much like poor Arvedawi. The other telling quote from this passage is, "It may be that if the crown and the scepter had been united, then the kingship would have been maintained and much evil averted." And I think what kept the crown and scepter from being united in that moment was the timing. Fresh off a vital military victory against the Wainriders, the Battle of the Camp, a positive outcome for Gondor, no doubt, Eärnil was the overwhelming favorite to assume leadership. And note that Arvedawi did not press his claim. He knew he was outmatched. That claim would have to wait for Aragorn. So there you have it. The Battle of the Camp. One of the pivotal moments in Gondor's history. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!